5.18 Access rights to information and other associated assets shall be provisioned, reviewed, modified and removed in accordance with the organization's topic-specific policy and the rules for access control. Very, very crucial. You have several kinds of assets. Assets could be physical assets. So there is a data center that you have. There is a server room that we have. There could be technology assets or IT assets, if I were to call them. And you could have information assets. We could have applications. Databases. I could have databases, files, other sort of information. So ISO 27001 requires you to have, you should look at the entire life cycle. How is this being provisioned? How is this being reviewed? If there is some modification required, and finally how are accesses being revoked or removed from people, systems, in keeping with the policy that we have. So this is the core of your information security principles. So you've got to be very, very careful about making a list of all your assets, looking at what are the protocols, what are the methods that you are deploying to be able to provide access to all these assets. Like I'm saying, the different kind of assets that you have. What is the policy? What is the structure that is being followed? So you got to look at creating a list, reviewing every asset from a access perspective. This is the core of ISO 27001. So please spend a lot of time auditing 5.18. 5.19 Information security in supplier relationships. So you have 19, 20, 21 and 22 all related to supplier relationships. The entire '19 is about information security in supplier relationship. 20 is about information security vis-a-vis supplier relationship. 21 is about ICT, the entire landscape, and 522 is about monitoring. So 4 specific requirements vis-a-vis your supplier relationship management. Let's read this first. 19. Processes and procedures shall be defined and implemented to manage information security risk associated with use of supplier products and services. Organizations will deploy suppliers or external providers to be able to provide for services to them. Right from the time you've identified what are the things that you need, you have to start thinking in terms of what are the information security risks that you are exposing yourself when you are putting together a supplier. So the entire life cycle of supplier onboarding, supplier handling, supplier monitoring, supplier deprovisioning will have to be carefully thought about. And that is what is expected. Let's read this again. It says, processes and procedures shall be defined and implemented to manage IS risks associated with the use of supplier products or services. So whatever product or services you use from a supplier, the organization will end up choosing several suppliers to handle their requirements. So ISO 27001 mandates you to understand what are the information security risks that we are exposed to when we are onboarding supplier services. So let's say I have taken a software as a service from a supplier. I am using certain cloud services. I am hiring some IT vendor. ISO 27001 requires you to look at processes and procedures for identification of information security risks associated with onboarding a supplier. 5.20 Addressing information security within supplier agreements. Relevant information security requirements shall be established and agreed with each supplier based on the type of supplier relationships. So based on what is my exposure. So if I am looking at using a SaaS product from a customer, from a vendor, I realize that should that software have some vulnerabilities, I will get into trouble. So ISO 27001 requires you to start looking at addressing all your security requirements with that supplier in form of some supplier agreements. So maybe a security audit could be a mandate. Any vulnerabilities that you have identified vis-a-vis the supplier must be addressed as part of your 520. Next, 5.21, managing information security in the information and communication technology supply chain. The entire information technology supply chain, right from your hardware, so software, middleware, firmware, whatever is being deployed, you have to realize that the entire supply chain will have certain security vulnerabilities, certain threats, risks. So you will have to ensure that processes and procedures are defined vis-a-vis the risks associated with the entire supply chain component. The entire ICT supply chain will have to be reviewed extensively, right from what are your processes of selecting a particular product or a service. How are you looking at prioritizing a vendor number one versus a vendor number two? Was that financial stability? Was that certain security requirements that were included? Price could not be the only determinant. So what are your structures, what are your procedures around the entire landscape of how are you provisioning, how are you managing them, how are you monitoring them? Your entire ICT supply chain processes and procedures need to be defined and they need to be implemented. That is what is required as part of your 5.21. 5.22, monitoring, review and change management of supplier services. Organizations shall regularly monitor, review, evaluate and manage change in supplier information security practices and service delivery. So monitoring processes are another set of mandates that come from ISO 27001. You need to regularly monitor, review, evaluate the supplier information security practices at a defined periodicity. So as auditor, you will want to see what are the current practices that the organization has vis-a-vis monitoring the supplier relationships, and how are being monitored is what you are looking at auditing from a 5.22 perspective.